Judge Grayson thought he was sentencing a clueless teen, until the defendant started dismantling the case like a seasoned lawyer. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt thick, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. The defendant's table looked too big for the young man standing beside it, hands in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Jalen Dawson, 19, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him made it clear, the real trial had nothing to do with the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood of his desk. He peered down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, his lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried a dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one, he never planned on standing here as a defendant, but he knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years, and Jalen had grown up listening to the stories she brought home. How prosecutors cut corners. How judges played favorites. How some defense attorneys barely tried. He absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another kid in trouble. "Let's make this quick." The judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again. But this time, something shifted. Jalen's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Because Grayson had just made his first mistake. But the courtroom hadn't noticed yet. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with weight. The crowd in the gallery shifted, whispering among themselves. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car. A chase. Running. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on." The prosecutor walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jalen didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me. And for most people in the room, it probably did. The case was clear-cut. A stolen car. A chase. An arrest. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent. Watching. Waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. All right. Let's hear the defense's response. He turned to Jalen's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. Your Honor, my client. Jalen placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Jalen spoke. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The room went completely silent. Grayson stared at him, clearly amused. You'll what? Jalen's voice was calm. Steady. I'll be defending myself. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward. Because everything was about to change. The weight of the courtroom settled around Jalen as he adjusted his stance, his hands still in his pockets. He let the silence stretch just a little longer, enough to make them uncomfortable. Then finally, he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. Go ahead. Jalen took a slow step forward. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Carrington exhaled sharply, already bored. That's right. And that testimony is written in his report? Of course it is. Jalen nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson squinted at him. On what grounds? Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Jalen took another step forward. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But, he let the word hang in the air. I have a feeling it won't. Now the murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Grayson frowned, glancing toward Carrington. Counselor. Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Jalen gave a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't? He let the sentence trail off. Grayson studied him for a long moment, then turned to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, their tactics, the way they played the system. And there was one thing he knew without a doubt: if Carrington was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Counselor. Carrington finally shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was loud. Carrington shuffled his papers, his polished confidence cracking around the edges. Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen gave a small nod, his face unreadable. That's true. He took a step forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically. He took a deep breath, his tone staying calm, controlled. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets. Maybe zip it up. Then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car. Didn't drive it. Didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sit for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked. Does touching something make you a criminal? Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. Jalen wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. He turned to Grayson. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated. Then, reluctantly. No. Jalen's lips pressed together. So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me. But they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine. Ask about the chain of custody. Or challenge the accuracy of the analysis. Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen nodded, like that was all he needed to hear. Interesting. Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Jalen wasn't done yet. Because the next thing he was about to say. It would change everything. Jalen took a slow step forward, his voice steady but firm. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Judge Grayson frowned. The owner? Jalen nodded. Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. He turned to Carrington. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Jalen didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen held the paper up. That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Grayson. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. But Jalen shook his head. No, I wasn't. His voice didn't rise. But it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast. And everyone knew it. Jalen turned back to the jury. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. Silence. Grayson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington was stiff, his face flushed. No, Your Honor. Judge Grayson exhaled. He looked at Jalen for a long time, then glanced at the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke, the words that would stay with everyone in that room. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence. Then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling in their notebooks. Jalen didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. Let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, looked at Jalen with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Maybe even regret. Jalen met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen stopped, but didn't turn. Grayson hesitated, then finally said. You should consider law school. Jalen smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the questions. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. His mother, Denise, was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. Boy, you scared me half to death. Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras kept flashing, but Jalen wasn't paying attention to them anymore. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else. Something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day. Another defendant. Another guilty plea. But now he knew. He'd remember this one. Because Jalen had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. Here's the lesson we should learn. How many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted? Not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth. Jalen had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. He knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. The justice system is built on laws. But it's run by people. And people can change. But only if we make them. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that matter. And let's keep the conversation going. Because next time, it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you know. The courthouse steps felt different this time. Jalen Dawson had walked out of that courtroom a free man, but his battle wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The weight of what had happened didn't hit him until later that night, when he sat at his mother's kitchen table, scrolling through news articles about his case. Teen genius outsmarts judge and prosecutor in shocking courtroom twist. 19-year-old defends himself in court, and wins. Jalen Dawson exposes flaws in the justice system. His name was everywhere. But not all of it was good. In the comment sections, some people called him a hero. Others called him reckless. And some said he had just gotten lucky. That part stuck with him. Lucky? No. Luck had nothing to do with it. He had been prepared. But how many others were sitting in jail right now, unprepared? How many had taken guilty pleas because they didn't know how to fight back? That thought kept him up that night. By morning, he knew what he had to do. "You're serious about this?" Lisa Thornton, the public defender who had barely spoken in court, stared at Jalen across a diner table, stirring her coffee. Jalen nodded. "I need to do something. People shouldn't be going to jail just because they don't know the law." Lisa sighed, setting down her spoon. "You realize law school isn't cheap, right?" Jalen smirked. "I'm not waiting for law school." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" Jalen leaned forward. "I want to start now. Teaching people. Helping them understand their rights. A lot of public defenders have too many cases to give every client the attention they deserve. I want to change that." Lisa exhaled, looking out the window. "You sound like a lawyer already." "Then help me." Lisa laughed. "Help you do what?" Jalen sat back. "I want to start a program. Free legal education. For kids like me. For anyone who needs it. People don't need to be lawyers to understand their rights." Lisa studied him for a long moment. Then she shook her head, smiling. "You're insane." Jalen grinned. "But am I wrong?" Lisa picked up her coffee. "No," she admitted. "You're not." Across town, in his office, Judge Walter Grayson sat in silence. The courtroom had seen thousands of cases under his watch. Most of them blurred together. But not this one. He had underestimated Jalen Dawson. Worse, he had been prepared to dismiss him before the trial had even started. That bothered him more than he cared to admit. He glanced at his laptop. The court transcript sat open. And there, near the end, were his own words staring back at him. "You should consider law school." Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe he had said it as an afterthought. Maybe it was just something to fill the silence. But now, he realized he meant it. For the first time in years, a defendant had challenged him. Had forced him to take a closer look at the system he had been a part of for decades. He didn't know what Jalen Dawson's future held. But one thing was certain. That courtroom hadn't seen the last of him. The first class was held in a borrowed community center. 15 people showed up. Some were teenagers, kids who had seen Jalen's case on the news. Others were older, people who had been through the system and wanted to understand what had happened to them. Jalen stood at the front, a whiteboard behind him, and took a deep breath. He wasn't a lawyer yet. But he knew how the system worked. And he was ready to teach. "All right," he said. "Let's start with the basics. What's the first thing you should say if you're arrested?" A few people exchanged nervous glances. Then a girl in the back raised her hand. "I want a lawyer." Jalen grinned. "Exactly." And just like that, it began. The system would never be the same again. Because Jalen Dawson had walked into that courtroom as a defendant. But one day, he would return. And this time, he wouldn't just be defending himself. He'd be defending others. "Let me know if you want more." Word spread quickly. What had started as 15 people in a borrowed community center soon became 30, then 50. Within a few months, Jalen's free legal education program had outgrown the small space. People from all over the city were showing up, eager to learn. Some were young, kids like Jalen who wanted to know their rights before they ever found themselves in a courtroom. Others were older, people who had already been through the system and wanted to understand how they had been failed. A few had family members in prison, hoping to find a way to help them. Jalen wasn't a lawyer yet. But he knew enough to give them what they had never had before, knowledge. He taught them about police encounters, about plea deals, about the tricks prosecutors used to get convictions. He brought in guest speakers, former public defenders, retired judges, even a few people who had been wrongfully convicted. People were listening. And then, one day, someone else was listening, too. Lisa Thornton sat across from Jalen at their usual diner, tapping a newspaper against the table. "You made the front page," she said, sliding it over to him. Jalen raised an eyebrow and looked down. Teen Legal Prodigy creates free program to teach underprivileged youth their rights. There was a photo of him standing in front of the whiteboard, mid-lesson. He hadn't even known a reporter had been there. Jalen smirked. "Not bad." Lisa leaned back in her seat. "You're getting attention. That's good. But it also means they're going to start watching you." "They?" "You know exactly who I mean. The system. The same people who let your case fall apart in court. They don't like people shaking things up. And that's exactly what you're doing." Jalen folded the newspaper and set it aside. "Good." Lisa sighed. "You really don't know when to back down, do you?" Jalen grinned. "Not my style." One of the first people to come to Jalen's class was a 17-year-old named Marcus. Marcus had been arrested 3 months earlier for trespassing. He and his friends had been skateboarding near an abandoned building when the cops showed up. Most of the other kids ran. Marcus didn't. He didn't think he had done anything wrong. The officer told him if he just answered a few questions, they'd let him go. He answered everything. A week later, he had a court date and a charge. When he first walked into Jalen's class, Marcus barely spoke. He sat in the back, hood up, arms crossed. He listened, but he didn't ask questions. Then one day, Jalen asked the group a simple question. "How many of you have ever been stopped by the police?" Nearly every hand in the room went up. Jalen nodded. "How many of you knew exactly what your rights were in that moment?" Almost every hand went down. Except for Marcus. Everyone turned to look at him. Marcus slowly lowered his hand, realizing something. "I thought I did," he said quietly. Jalen gestured for him to continue. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "They told me I wasn't in trouble," he said. "They just wanted to talk. I didn't think I needed a lawyer because I didn't do anything wrong." Jalen nodded. "That's what they want you to think. They don't have to tell you the truth. They can lie. They can say you're free to go when they really plan on arresting you. And the second you start talking, they'll use every word against you." Marcus clenched his jaw. "They tricked me. They tricked a lot of people," Jalen said. "And that's why we're here." A month later, Marcus stood at the front of the class, leading his own lesson. Lisa watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, shaking her head with a smile. "You've created a monster," she joked to Jalen. Jalen grinned. "Good. We need more of them." One night, long after the class had ended and everyone had gone home, Jalen sat in the empty room, staring at his phone. His mother had told him to slow down. Lisa had warned him he was making too much noise. But something in his gut told him this was only the beginning. He opened a blank document on his laptop and typed 3 words at the top of the page. Dawson Legal Initiative. It wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a movement. And he wasn't stopping anytime soon. "Let me know if you want more." Word of the Dawson legal initiative spread far beyond the city. What had started as a free class in a borrowed room was now being talked about in universities, on social media, and even in legal circles. Lawyers, activists, and law students reached out, offering to volunteer. A few public defenders, frustrated with a system that overworked them and underprotected their clients, joined the cause. Jalen had never asked for attention, but it kept coming. And then, one day, an email arrived that changed everything. Lisa found Jalen sitting outside the community center, staring at his phone, his expression unreadable. "You look like someone just handed you a lawsuit." Jalen didn't look up. "Close," he muttered, handing her the phone. Lisa read the email. Then she read it again. It was from the American Civil Liberties Union. They wanted to meet. Lisa let out a low whistle. "They don't reach out to just anyone." "What did you do?" Jalen smirked. "I guess I made some noise." A week later, he sat across from 3 ACLU representatives in a sleek office. They had been watching him. They had seen his trial, seen how he had torn apart a case that should have been open and shut. "You have potential, Jalen," one of them said. "And more importantly, you have reach. People are listening to you." They wanted to offer him something. Not money. Not a job. Something bigger. A platform. They wanted to partner with him, help him expand his initiative, connect him with legal experts, and, if he wanted it, help him get into law school immediately. Jalen listened, nodding. But when they finished, he leaned forward. "I appreciate this," he said. "Really. But I need to be clear, if I do this, I do it my way. No red tape. No filtering the truth. If I see corruption, I call it out. If I see injustice, I fight it. No one tells me to back off." The lead representative studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small smile, she nodded. "That's exactly why we're here." 3 months later, the Dawson Legal Initiative had its own headquarters. A real office. A staff. It wasn't just a class anymore. It was a movement. And Jalen? He was leading it. Judge Grayson watched all of this unfold from a distance. He had followed Jalen's journey. He had seen the headlines, the interviews, the impact. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. One afternoon, as Jalen was leaving his office, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against a car. Judge Grayson. Jalen slowed his steps. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said. Grayson shrugged. "You've been busy." Jalen crossed his arms. "Something tells me this isn't a social visit." Grayson sighed. "I wanted to say something. About your trial. About how I handled it." Jalen raised an eyebrow. "I already won, Judge. What's left to say?" Grayson met his gaze. "You shouldn't have had to win in the first place." Jalen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Grayson straightened. "I spent years thinking I was fair. That I judged cases based on facts. But when you walked into my courtroom that day, I didn't see a young man who understood the law. I saw a kid who I assumed didn't. I didn't realize that until later." Jalen was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "You know, most people in your position wouldn't admit that." Grayson let out a dry chuckle. "Most people in my position don't like to admit they're wrong." Jalen smirked. "Yeah, I figured that out." Grayson hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. "My chambers are always open," he said, handing it to Jalen. "If you ever want to sit in on a trial. Or just talk." Jalen took the card but didn't look at it right away. Instead, he studied Grayson for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "I might take you up on that." Grayson gave him a small smile. I hope you do. As the judge walked away, Jalen glanced down at the card. And for the first time since his trial, he felt it. He wasn't just fighting the system from the outside anymore. He was changing it from within. And this? This was only the beginning. Let me know if you want more. Jalen sat at his desk late that night, staring at the judge's card. He had spent months fighting the system, exposing flaws, and giving people the knowledge they needed to protect themselves. But for the first time, he wondered, could he do more from the inside? Lisa knocked on the open door of his office, arms crossed. You look like you're debating whether to take over the world or burn it down. Jalen smirked. Why not both? Lisa stepped inside, glancing at the judge's card on his desk. You thinking about it? Jalen sighed, leaning back in his chair. I don't know. I spent so much time tearing the system apart, I don't know if I can actually work inside it. Lisa pulled up a chair and sat down across from him. You don't have to change who you are to do this, Jalen. If anything, we need more people like you on the inside. Jalen tapped the card against the desk. Judge Grayson was part of the problem. He admitted it. Lisa nodded. And now? He's trying to be part of the solution. Maybe that means something. Jalen exhaled. Maybe it did. The next morning, he walked into the courthouse, not as a defendant, not as an activist, but as an observer. Judge Grayson glanced up from the bench as Jalen entered and gave the smallest of nods. Jalen took a seat in the back, watching. This time, he wasn't standing at the defense table. But one day, he would be. Weeks passed. Jalen kept teaching, kept growing the initiative, but something was different. He spent more time in courtrooms, sitting in on cases, watching trials, studying how things worked from the inside. And then, an opportunity came knocking. A lawyer, one of the volunteers at his initiative, pulled him aside after a class. You ever thought about taking the bar early? Jalen frowned. That's not how it works. The lawyer smirked. Not normally, no. But there's a way. Some states allow you to take the bar without going to law school, if you apprentice under a licensed attorney. Jalen's mind raced. Like the old school way? Exactly. It's rare, but it's legal. You'd have to study under someone for a few years, but with what you already know. You could do it. Jalen leaned against the table, processing. No law school. No student loans. Just learning the law hands-on. It was crazy. It was perfect. Lisa nearly choked on her coffee when he told her. You're telling me you want to become a lawyer without going to law school? You really don't like doing things the normal way, do you? Jalen grinned. You should know that by now. Lisa exhaled, shaking her head. Okay. Who's gonna sponsor you? Jalen slid a business card across the table. Lisa picked it up, eyes widening. Judge Walter Grayson. You have got to be kidding me. Jalen shrugged. He offered. I took him up on it. Lisa set the card down, rubbing her temples. This is insane. But am I wrong? Lisa groaned. You really need to stop saying that. Jalen laughed. A week later, he sat in Judge Grayson's chambers, going over case law, legal procedures, and trial strategy. It was real. He was doing it. One day, he would stand in that courtroom, not as a defendant, not as an observer, but as a lawyer. And when that day came, the system wouldn't know what hit it.